Most mornings when we get up, we expect something that's rather routine ahead of us. I've invited this couple on today to share their story. It's truly a long obedience in the same direction. This is part one of a two-part interview. Thank you, everyone, for joining me today. I am happy to welcome our friends from long ago, John and Patti Franklin, to the channel. John and Patti lived a couple blocks up the street from us for many years when we lived in Southern California, and they have since moved to Georgia to be near their daughter and her family. So welcome to the channel, John and Patti.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Well, we're going to start going back to June 14th, 1987. It was an important day in my life and our family's life because it was a day that I was kind of suddenly and unexpectedly paralyzed. And it was, like I said, it was a kind of a surprise thing. It was a rare medical condition, but just to share with you what that day was like. It was a Sunday. When we got up that morning, it seemed like a pretty ordinary day. Nothing unusual was going on there, just a good church service. After church, we were at Rich and Cheryl Bullock's house for a barbecue, and a bunch of people from the church. We were played on our church co-ed softball team. And the game was scheduled to start at 6 p.m. that evening, just at Orchard Park. So the game started at 6. And again, at that point, we had no idea what was lurking for us around the corner. But about a little more than halfway through the game, it was about 7 o'clock. Our team was having a big rally. I had been up to bat. I had gotten a hit. The few batters after me also got hits. I came around and scored the run, and just as I reached home plate, I looked up the first baseline and I saw nobody was in the coaching box there. So I just ran up the first baseline and figured, okay, I'll be the coach, for now, while the rest of the inning played itself out. But just as I reached the coaching box, I felt a sharp stabbing pain right in the base of my neck over here on the left side. I had no idea what it was at the time, but I knew it hurt, and it hurt a lot. And as the inning came to an end a few minutes later, I knew I couldn't continue in the game. So I just went back to the dugout, told our manager, take me out of the game. I can't play anymore. And I just sat on the bench for the last half hour of the game. And as the game ended at 7:30 and everybody stood up to leave, I stood up, except I guess I must have been a little wobbly, because the instant I stood up, all of a sudden, two of the guys around me, Dirk DeCreek was on my left and Brian McNutt was on my right. They both kind of caught me. And at that point, we realized, wow, there's really something serious going on. And so Patti ran to get our car out in the parking lot. And with my leaning on Dirk on one side and Brian on the other side, I was still able to walk at that point with their support. We got me to our car, we got me into the car, and we headed for Los Robles Hospital, which is the local hospital about 10 minutes away. By the time we got to the hospital, some folks from the game had called ahead and let the emergency room know we were coming in. So there were some people out there to meet us, and they got me immediately into a wheelchair, got me into the hospital. It was about 8 o'clock at night at this point. And by about 8:15, I was admitted to the emergency room. But I was really never able to remember much more of what happened that night, but people related to me what happened. My body started spasming, And by about 9:30 or 10 o'clock at night, the paralysis, which had started in my feet, had spread all the way up my body, and I was paralyzed from the neck down. And so what started out as a day that seemed very normal ended up as a day with me in intensive care there in the hospital, kind of wondering what in the world had happened. And so that kind of began kind of a new chapter, both in my life, but also in my family's life.
So the treatment from that point on, you were in the hospital for a while, right? And then you went into rehab.
Right. I was in intensive care for 2 months. And at the end of that time, I really still didn't have much movement. When they transferred me to the rehab hospital, at least meant I was out of any danger. My condition was stable. And but the first day I was in the rehab hospital, they had to rig up a special call button because I actually couldn't, my hands weren't strong enough that I could even push a button on the call button, but they found a way to rig up a special call button that I could kind of move my hand like that, but I couldn't move my fingers. So that kind of got me started at the rehab hospital. And from there, actually a pretty decent recovery started. And a few months later, I came out of rehab, although I still couldn't do much on my own. I needed assistance in pretty much everything, getting in and out of bed or things like that. But ultimately, a year or so later, I was able to go back to work. And ultimately, while I was never able to stand or walk again on my own, I was able to function well enough to be able to go on business trips by myself and stay overnight in hotels and go riding around in airlines and stuff like that. So in one sense, the recovery was pretty good. In another sense, when this kind of thing happens to you, you're always hoping you'll be able to walk again. And so that was one of those disappointments to me, but something that I found I was just going to have to deal with. And, from that, I could fast forward another 35 years to when we were living in Georgia. I decided to write a book to kind of recount the entire experience. And I'll just read the first page of the book to kind of give you an idea of what the last 35 years were like. The book starts, I never asked to be paralyzed. God didn't consult me. It wasn't my choice. But once I was paralyzed, I had lots of choices about how I would live the rest of my life, however long or short that might be. I never saw myself as being responsible for the struggle that was before me, but I knew for sure that I was responsible for how I handled it. So that's a quick summary of the last 35 years, but from there, maybe Patti would like to. Patti was kind of instrumental in this book that we published on Amazon earlier this year. So I'll let her explain how the book came about.
Patti, go ahead and tell us how that came about.
As Cheryl said, we moved to Georgia from California, and we have 3 children, all married with children of their own, and they were sort of spread around the country. But being here, it has worked out so far that every other Thanksgiving, we were all together, which was such a wonderful thing. And this time was coming up in 2021. Our oldest grandson, we have 11 grandchildren. The oldest is a boy. He was 17 at the time, and our youngest is a girl who was 3. And this has just been on my mind that the kids had never seen John other than in a wheelchair, but we had never talked about how that happened or any of the details. And so I talked to John about it. Then we talked to our kids and asked for permission, because one of our traditions is having teas together. And I always do it like a big tea for all the cousins. And we thought that would be a good time. We'll just take a few minutes, just sort of give them some background. And then what we were hoping is that would open it up. So if they had questions, they would feel free because we had taken the initiative to talk about it. So that's sort of how that happened.
Right, so that Thanksgiving, everyone was in for maybe 3 or 4 days before and after Thanksgiving. And after we took maybe 15 or 20 minutes, because again, with some of the children being young, there was a limit to what we could tell them. But at the end of it, we thought it went very well. But after everyone left and went home, I began thinking, boy, it was nice to do 15 minutes, but I think it's really time after 35 years to write a book. And for me to put down what I think, not just what happened to me that day, but what did I learn from it? How did it affect how I looked at life after that? How did it affect, all of our lives? Because it affected Patti and our children as well. And so about 2 weeks after that Thanksgiving get together, I started writing, this book. And from my point of view, it was a way of saying, well, as once the grandchildren reached either teenagehood or adulthood, they may find some benefit from reading this because the book is about a struggle and the struggles I've gone through. But let's face it, most of us in this life go through some sort of struggle. And so I felt like none of them are likely to be paralyzed and in a wheelchair. And so I didn't really want the book to be about being paralyzed and in a wheelchair. I really wanted it to be about how do you deal with a struggle that you wish you didn't have. In the second chapter of the book, I shared, I guess, one of my favorite lessons that I learned very early on after I was paralyzed. It actually happened the second week I was in intensive care. I was moved into a room with one other person, and we never actually spoke because at the time I was not only paralyzed head to toe, but I couldn't speak either. So, but I learned his name was Bob. And as he came into this room, my bed was the first bed in the room, and then Bob's was the second. And there was a big kind of green curtain that separated, both of us. So most of the time we couldn't see him, but I still remember very vividly, even today, the first day we were together. So at 7 a.m. on the first morning, one of the hospital staff came in with this great looking tray of breakfast. And I wasn't able to eat any solid food at the time. They were just feeding me through a feeding tube. So the tray went right by me, but I got a good look at it. It was 2 eggs, bacon, toast, orange juice, and I can tell you it looked great.
I was going to say, it's the little things, huh?
That's right. When you can't have it, it looks even better. So they brought the food into Bob. Then maybe it was about an hour later, somebody came to pick up the breakfast, and I couldn't really see what was going on because the curtain was between our 2 beds, but I could hear them talking, and the person who was picking up the tray was saying, "Oh, Bob, what's the matter? You didn't eat most of your breakfast." I could hear him saying something, but it sounded most like mumbling or grumbling or something. But at the time I was thinking like, wow, like send some of that breakfast over to me. I'd be happy to finish it off. But they took the breakfast away. Then a couple hours later, a physical therapist came in and again, went right by me, but went over to Bob's bed and said, "Okay, Bob, we just want to see if you want to get up and do some walking today." So he actually did. And that this was the one time during the week we were together, I actually saw him. He used the walker. He was maybe a slight person. Maybe he was 5'9", 5'10", and looked to me like he was maybe 70 years old or so. And he walked by me. Then about a half an hour later, they came back at the end of the session and he got back in bed. But later on in the day, in the afternoon, the physical therapist came back and again said, "Hey, Bob, would you like to get up and do some walking with a walker again?" And again, I couldn't hear an answer, but I heard some grumbling and mumbling, and I heard the physical therapist say, "Oh, so you don't want to walk? Okay, we'd be happy to help you, but if you don't want to, we'll just come back tomorrow." Well, this whole scenario repeated itself every single day. And by the end of the week, I was thinking like, man, this guy doesn't really appreciate, the fact that he can like eat food, and he doesn't appreciate the fact that he can walk, and I would give anything, to be able to eat food or to walk. And this guy is just an ingrate. And so anyway, but at the end of that week, they moved him to a different room and me to a different room, and I never saw him again. But 4 weeks later, I was still there in intensive care, and there was always a nurse in with me. But in this particular day, a second nurse came in. Her name was Ursula, and she had gotten to know me a couple weeks earlier when I kind of went through a crisis time. Ursula was known as the nurse in intensive care that took on the most difficult situations that were kind of in crisis. And she had been involved with me 2 weeks earlier. Now things were quieter, but it was nice to see her again. And she came over to me and said, "John, remember Bob, who you were with in that room a few weeks back?" She said, "Bob just died this morning." And then she proceeded to tell me, just maybe in 2 or 3 minutes, a little of his background. He had come into the hospital 6 months earlier. He had a, incurable problem. I think it was emphysema. He was terminally ill, and he had just left instructions not to use any sort of heroic actions to kind of save him. And that morning, he had gone into cardiac arrest and he had died. And with relating that to me, then Ursula left. Of course, Ursula had no idea what I had originally thought about Bob. But when she related this to me, the first thing I was thinking was like, wow, this was the person I was so envious of, 4 weeks earlier. And now I find out he's died. And I may not be in great shape, but I'm still around. And then as I thought about it further, I thought like, why did I feel the way I did? And finally, I realized that I was seeing Bob based on the things that I had lost in my own life. And the only thing I could see about him was he could eat, I couldn't eat. He could walk, I couldn't walk. And what did I miss about him? Well, only the most important thing. He was a terminally ill person who was just in the hospital to spend his last little bit of time. And so one of the lessons I've learned, and I really have thanked God for this ever since it happened, but very early in my time dealing with this problem, God decided to teach me that when I was looking at other people, I can't look at them based on the losses I have in my life. I can't define other people like that. And if I do, I'm going to miss what they're really all about. And so I've had the benefit of this for the last 35 years. I'm somewhat embarrassed to tell people that I was envious of a person in intensive care, that I've always said to myself, shouldn't I have known there might have been something wrong? But upon thinking about it, it just showed me what bad shape I was in, just kind of like emotionally and every other way, that I just naturally defaulted to defining him by what I was missing in my life. And so just understanding that I can't define other people by what I'm missing, I have to deal with my own issues. That turned out to be just a great gift to me, because I also remember the first time I left the hospital a few months later and went out on, somebody was wheeling my wheelchair for me, and we were out on the street. And the first thing I saw was a whole bunch of people walking around. But the first thing that popped into my mind that time was, okay, why am I noticing that there are people all walking around? Okay, that's because I can't walk. And at that point, even a few months down the road, I realized, okay, I don't know anything about these people, but I am not going to define them by what I'm missing in my life. And so that's just, it's helped me relate much better to people and not always be feeling like, my problems are the biggest ones in the world.
Some real breakthrough lessons here, huh?
Right, right. And it wasn't like I knew I needed that. I just got taught that from
Mhm.
doing one of the probably most foolish things that I ever did in my life, which was judging somebody just based on things that were totally wrong. Sometimes mistakes can help you see where you need to improve. And so that was one that I just got clobbered, realizing how foolish I had been. And
Yeah.
that helped me resolve that I wasn't going to keep doing that.